Briarwood was a small, peaceful town surrounded by green hills and thick forests. The sun would shine brightly over the rolling fields in the morning, and in the evenings, the air would be filled with the sounds of birds chirping. The streets were quiet, lined with old brick houses, each with a garden full of flowers or vegetables. It felt like a place where nothing bad could ever happen, a place where families could live happily without a care in the world. In one of the older homes at the edge of town lived the Anderson family. Their house was not the newest or the biggest, but it was warm, filled with the smell of freshly baked bread and the sound of laughter. Jack, the father, was a tall and strong man who worked hard on their farm. Every morning, he would wake up before the sun and head to the fields to take care of the animals and plants. He loved the land and worked hard to provide for his family. Lily, the mother, was a kind woman with a gentle smile that everyone in Briarwood loved. She spent her days in the house, cooking meals and keeping the house tidy. She was always ready with a warm hug or a kind word for anyone who needed it. Her love for her family was clear in everything she did. Their daughter, Hannah, was a curious 10-year-old. She had dark hair and bright eyes full of wonder. She loved to explore the world around her, especially the woods near their home. Every day, after finishing her chores, she would run outside and play, dreaming of grand adventures that she read about in her favorite books. She was very close to her younger brother, Ethan, who was only 5 years old, but already full of energy and questions. He loved to follow Hannah around, trying to do everything she did, always looking up to her. It was a peaceful life, one that many would envy. The neighbors often visited, bringing pies or jars of jam to share. Everyone in Briarwood knew each other, and the community was close-knit. They took care of each other, and there was no real worry or trouble. Hannah, though, often dreamed of something more. She would lie in bed at night, staring at the stars, wondering what lay beyond the hills. Maybe one day, I'll find an adventure, she would think. But for now, her life was filled with helping her mother, playing with Ethan, and exploring the fields and woods nearby. As the day began, the sun climbed higher in the sky, and the quiet sounds of morning filled the air. Jack was out in the fields, tending to the crops. Lily was inside, kneading dough for the bread. Hannah and Ethan played outside, their laughter ringing through the air as they ran through the tall grass in the backyard. Everything felt perfect in that moment, and nothing seemed out of place in the little town of Briarwood. The day had started just like any other in Briarwood. The sun was high in the sky, and the air felt warm and peaceful. Hannah had spent the afternoon running through the meadows with Ethan, her little brother following closely behind. She loved the simple life in Briarwood, but she still had a little voice inside her that longed for something more, something exciting. As evening approached, however, something strange began to happen. A dark cloud appeared in the sky, growing larger and darker by the minute. The wind began to pick up, turning the peaceful evening into something eerie. Hannah's mother, Lily, stood by the window, watching the storm approach. She could feel a change in the air. Something was coming. "Jack!" she called out to her husband, who was still in the fields. "Come inside. The storm is coming." Jack, who had been working in the fields, didn't seem to notice the storm at first. But when he looked up at the sky, his face changed. Dark clouds were gathering above the hills, and the wind was beginning to howl. Jack hurried into the house, just as the first heavy raindrops began to fall. The wind was fierce now, and the trees bent with the gusts. Everyone ran to the windows, watching the storm grow stronger. It was as if the sky itself had turned angry. Hannah loved storms. She would often sit by the window, watching the rain pour down, feeling the rush of energy in the air. But this storm was different. As she stood at the window, her eyes wide with wonder, she heard something strange. "Hannah," a soft voice called, but it wasn't her mother or father. It didn't even sound like anyone she knew. It was a soft, faint sound, as if the wind itself was speaking her name. She frowned, confused. It was probably just the wind, she thought. She had always imagined the wind could talk, whispering secrets to her when it blew through the trees. But this voice sounded different. It was almost inviting. "Hannah," the voice repeated, louder now, clearer. "Come closer." Hannah's heart skipped a beat. She stood frozen for a moment, trying to decide if she had really heard anything. She looked out the window, peering through the rain to the edge of the woods just beyond the house. The trees swayed in the wind, but there was no one out there. Still, the voice echoed in her ears. She shook her head. "It's just the storm," she muttered, trying to convince herself. But even as she said it, a strange feeling tugged at her. Something wasn't quite right. Later that night, as the storm raged on, Hannah couldn't stop thinking about the voice. It stayed with her, a whisper in the back of her mind. She told herself it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew that something had changed, something she couldn't quite understand. The next morning, the storm was gone, and the sun was shining once again. The air smelled fresh, and the birds were singing. It felt like nothing had happened the night before. But for Hannah, everything seemed different. As the day went on, she noticed strange things happening. It was a small thing at first. She was helping her mother in the garden, pulling weeds from the flowers, when she noticed that the flowers seemed to look brighter than usual. They were more colorful, more vibrant. As she reached out to touch one, the petals seemed to open wider, as if they were happy to see her. That's odd, she thought. The flowers don't usually do that. But she pushed the thought away and went about her day. Yet, it wasn't just the flowers. Every time she walked through the garden, the leaves rustled more loudly. It was as if the wind itself was following her. At school, things felt even stranger. Hannah found it hard to concentrate. Her teacher, Mrs. Potter, noticed how distracted she was. "Hannah, is everything all right?" she asked gently, looking at the young girl with concern. "I'm fine," Hannah replied quickly, but her voice didn't sound convincing. Her mind kept wandering to the woods, to the strange voice from the night before. Even in class, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling her. It was as though the earth beneath her feet was alive, pulling her in some strange direction. She tried to focus on her lessons, but it was impossible. Her thoughts were elsewhere. The days that followed were filled with more of the strange occurrences. It wasn't just the flowers or the wind anymore. Hannah began to feel different. There was a strange sense of power inside her, like she could hear the trees talking, or feel the soil beneath her feet more strongly. One afternoon, as she wandered near the woods, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. A man stood at the edge of the trees. He was tall, wearing a dark coat that blended with the shadows of the forest. His eyes were deep, dark, and intense. He was staring straight at her, and his gaze felt like it could see right through her. Hannah froze. Who was he? What was he doing here? The man didn't move. He didn't say anything. He simply watched her with those dark eyes. There was something strange about him, something that made her feel both curious and frightened. She took a step closer, but the man didn't react. He just stood there, as if waiting for her to come to him. But then, before she could take another step, he disappeared. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone. Hannah stood in the clearing, her heart racing. She looked around, trying to see where the man had gone, but there was nothing. The woods were quiet again. The wind rustled the leaves, but there was no sign of him. That night, as she lay in bed, the voice came again. This time, it was stronger, more urgent. "Hannah, come closer. You must come to the woods." Hannah shivered. She didn't know what to think anymore. Who was this voice? Why was it calling her? Days passed, and everything seemed normal again in Briarwood. But for Hannah, things had changed. Every moment, it felt as though the voice in her mind was growing louder, more insistent. The flowers in the garden seemed to bloom whenever she was near, and the breeze seemed to follow her wherever she went. It wasn't just her imagination. There was something real about it, something that felt impossible to ignore. One morning, she woke up early, her heart racing. The moment her eyes opened, the voice was there again, calling to her from deep within the woods. It was stronger now, clearer. "Hannah, you must come closer. The trees are waiting for you," the voice called. Hannah squeezed her eyes shut. The words filled her mind, and it was like her thoughts were no longer her own. She could almost hear the trees speaking to her too, urging her to go. It felt like something big was about to happen, and she was the one who had to make it happen. Hannah tried to ignore it. She tried to focus on the things she used to love, playing with Ethan, helping her mom in the kitchen. But the voice was always there, whispering just beneath the surface of her thoughts. At school, things didn't feel right. Her teacher, Mrs. Potter, noticed her distraction again. "Hannah, are you okay?" she asked, her voice kind, but filled with concern. "I'm fine," Hannah replied quickly, not looking up from her book. But inside, she was restless. The voice was so loud now. She wanted to run to the woods. She wanted to know who or what was calling her. After school, instead of going home, Hannah found herself wandering toward the forest again. She didn't know why, but her feet moved as if they had a mind of their own. The trees stood tall and dark before her, the air thick with the scent of pine and earth. It felt like the forest was waiting for her. When she stepped into the woods, she felt a strange shiver run through her. It wasn't the normal coolness of the trees or the rustle of the leaves. It was something deeper, something that felt like it was drawing her in. She walked for what felt like hours, the voice still calling her, louder now. She knew she had to find the source. And then, suddenly, she saw him again, the tall man with dark eyes. He was standing in a small clearing just ahead, waiting for her. This time, he spoke. "You have come," he said in a deep, quiet voice. Hannah's heart raced as she stood frozen. She didn't know what to say. Who was this man? What did he want from her? "You are the one," the man continued, his eyes locked onto hers. "You are the one who can change everything." Hannah swallowed hard. "Change what?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was something darker, something that sent a chill down her spine. "You can have anything you want," he said. "Anything. But you must come to me. You must make a promise. and I will give it to you. The choice is yours." Hannah felt the weight of his words pressing down on her. The idea of having everything she ever dreamed of, wealth, power, comfort, it was tempting. But something in her gut told her that this was not a decision to make lightly. "Come to me," the man repeated, his voice soothing like a lullaby. Hannah stood there, torn. The voice in her head was urging her to step forward, to accept the man's offer. But the part of her that had always trusted her family, the part of her that knew right from wrong, was still hesitant. The man watched her, waiting. The next few days felt different. Hannah kept thinking about the man, about the offer he had given her. Every time she walked through the fields, she could almost feel his presence in the air. His words echoed in her mind, and she couldn't push them away. At home, her parents began to notice the change in her. She was quieter than usual, more distant. She spent less time with Ethan and more time alone, staring out the window or wandering near the woods. Lily, her mother, noticed how her eyes seemed far away, as if Hannah was thinking about something else, something that worried her mother. One afternoon, Mrs. Bailey, a neighbor from down the road, stopped by to visit Lily. She was an older woman, known for her wise, if sometimes cryptic, advice. She'd always been kind to Hannah and her family. But today, her face was serious. "Lily," Mrs. Bailey said softly, "I've heard things. People are talking about strange happenings in Briarwood. Things that don't make sense." Lily frowned. "What do you mean?" "I've been hearing stories about deals being made, about people who call others into the woods, people who ask for promises. It's not something we should ignore." Mrs. Bailey's voice dropped to a whisper, as if afraid someone might hear. Lily felt her heart sink. "You don't mean Hannah, do you?" Mrs. Bailey nodded slowly. "I don't know, but you must be careful. I've seen this before, Lily. It never ends well." Lily didn't know what to think. Was Mrs. Bailey just worried? Or was there something more going on? That evening, when Jack came home from the fields, Lily tried to talk to him about it. But Jack was still busy with the farm, trying to make sure everything was running smoothly. He didn't seem to notice the strange things happening around him. "Hannah's just going through a phase," Jack said, his voice firm. "She's fine." But Lily wasn't so sure. Something felt wrong. As the days went by, the strange happenings only grew stronger. The crops in the garden started to grow at an unnatural speed, ripening almost overnight. The animals on the farm grew quieter and more distant. Jack couldn't understand it. But Lily knew something was wrong. Something wasn't right with their daughter. Hannah's mind was torn. She had never been one to ignore her family, her home, the things that made her life good. But the voice, the man, the promise, they were too tempting. Every time she saw the crops grow faster, heard the wind whisper her name, she wondered if the man's offer was real. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, she found herself walking toward the woods again. This time, she didn't fight it. She was too drawn in, too curious about what would happen next. When she arrived at the clearing, the man was there, waiting for her. "You are here," he said, his dark eyes gleaming. "I'm ready," Hannah whispered, her heart racing. The man smiled, and this time it wasn't a comforting smile. "You have made the right choice," he said. "Now, all you need to do is promise." "What do I need to promise?" Hannah asked, her voice trembling. The man's smile widened. "You promise to give me everything in return for the power you seek. You promise to trust me, to accept my offer, and in return, I will give you everything. Your family will never want for anything again." Hannah hesitated. The weight of the promise seemed heavy, too heavy. She could feel the trees around her, their silent gaze watching her every move. Now, from this point, the story will be continued in the next part.